Hi everyone, in this review lecture I'll be going through the 5 items that received the most requests for discussion in last week's discussion forum. But before I get into those 5 items, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the format for the exam so that you can know what to expect when you sit down to take it. This exam will cover material from weeks 1 through 3. However, there won't be anything on the exam that's not on the study guide. The ID questions, as I'll talk a little bit more about, they'll be taken from the ID list on the study guide, and the 2 essay questions will be taken from the 5 essay questions on the study guide. You'll have an hour and 15 minutes to complete the exam, but it's important to keep in mind that once you start the exam, that timer starts ticking down. So it's really important that you don't start the exam until you're ready to take it. And it's also really important to make sure that you study for the exam. You're taking the exam at home or wherever you're doing the work for this course. And so that means that you certainly can use your textbook, your notes, or any other materials that you have, but it's really important to keep in mind that that shouldn't be a reason not to study for the exam. You have an hour and 15 minutes, like I said, which should be enough time to write your responses, but it's definitely not going to be enough time if you haven't done the reading beforehand and you're hunting and pecking through the chapters covered on this exam. So even though it's open book and open note, it's still really important to make sure that you study and that you're prepared when you sit down to take the exam. Like I mentioned before, there'll be 6 identification questions that will be drawn from the list of ID items on the study guide. For the ID questions, it's important, or it's necessary actually, to both identify the item and also to explain its historical significance. And that first part is usually the easier part. That's simply explaining who this person was, what this event was, just identifying this item. The second part is explaining its historical significance. And it's a really good idea to make your explanation of that historical significance as obvious to me as possible, so that when I'm working my way through this digital stack of exams that I'll have after everyone's done, you're just hitting me over the head with that statement of that item's significance. You could write about why this item's worth knowing about, what kind of legacy or impact did it have, why is this item historically significant. And like I said, you just want to make that explanation really obvious. You can write something like, this item is historically significant because of X, Y, or Z. Just make that a really clear statement of historical significance. You're writing 1 short paragraph for each of the ID questions, so that's 3 to 4 sentences for each of those. You're writing a bit more for the 2 essay questions. So there'll be 2 essay questions drawn from the 5 essay questions on the study guide. And so that means that if you're ready for whatever 5, or if you're ready for all 5 that are on the study guide, you'll be ready for whatever 2 happen to be on the exam. And like I said, you're writing just a bit more for the essay questions. You're writing 2 to 3 paragraphs for the essay questions compared to just 1 short paragraph for the ID questions. And it's just important to keep in mind that a paragraph is at least 3 sentences. And so if you are writing just a sentence or 2 for the essay questions, you're really not going to be able to fully answer the question, and you will lose a fair number of points for that. So just make sure that you're writing at least 6 sentences and that you're really fully responding to the questions that you have on the exam. The ID questions are worth 10 points apiece. There's 6 of those. The essay questions are worth 20 points apiece, and altogether the exam is worth 100 points. All right, let's take a look now at the 5 items that I'll be going through in this study guide, the 5 items that had the most requests for discussion, and they are the head right system, salutary neglect, And the essay questions: how did the aims and motivations for establishing the Jamestown colony in Virginia differ from the aims and motivations for establishing the Plymouth colony in New England? The essay question: what did John Winthrop mean when he described the colonial venture he and his fellow Puritans were undertaking as an effort to establish a city on a hill? And lastly, we have the question: what were the primary reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed as a structure of government? And we're going to start with the headright system. And the headright system was a policy that was put in place by the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was the joint stock company that funded the Jamestown colony, that acted as the de facto government for the Jamestown colony, and the Virginia Company was really desperate to attract more people to the colony and also to develop the colony into a sustainable society. They wanted families to come, they wanted women to come so that there would be children and that this could develop into a sustainable society. And this headright system awarded 50 acres of land to any colonist who paid their own passage across the Atlantic from England to Jamestown, or you would get another 50 acres for each other individual whose passage that you paid for. So in addition to simply attracting more individuals to engage in tobacco cultivation, this headright system encouraged family groups to migrate together, as more family members traveling to Jamestown would mean that the family would get more land. It also meant that anyone who brought a sizable number of indentured servants with them, that they would immediately acquire a large estate to cultivate significant amounts of tobacco. And owing to the labor-intensive nature of tobacco cultivation and a headright system that encouraged settlers to bring numerous servants to the Virginia colony in order to amass large estates, indentured servants came to represent 2/3 of the English settlers who migrated to the Chesapeake region. So when it comes to the historical significance of the headright system, you could write about how the headright system really established land as the basis for wealth in Virginia. This system encouraged colonists to bring indentured servants with them, and then later on, when enslaved Africans came to replace English indentured servants as the primary source of labor on Virginia, this policy still held. So people who brought slaves with them were able to acquire quite a lot of land to cultivate tobacco. And it really established very firmly this link between land and wealth and political power that was the basis for the political system and the social system in the Jamestown colony. The next item that we have is salutary neglect, and this was the policy that Great Britain adopted towards its colonies in North America, and it's helpful here to think about what the word salutary means and what it means in combination with this other word, neglect. So salutary means something that's beneficial, and this kind of goes against neglect, because usually we think of neglect as being a bad thing. If a parent neglects their child, that's a bad thing. But in this case, we're talking about beneficial neglect. And the reason why this was seen as being beneficial, at least by many people in the colonies, is that Great Britain essentially was preoccupied with events taking place outside of North America, meaning it adopted this this policy of salutary or beneficial neglect. And so the colonies were largely left to govern their own affairs. There wasn't a tremendous amount of direct involvement by the British Parliament or the British Crown. And this really differed a lot from how a lot of the other European colonies in North America functioned. If you look at the Spanish colonies, if you look at Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns were much more directly involved in governing their colonies in the Americas compared to Great Britain. And since Great Britain took this largely hands-off approach, the colonists were in a lot of ways free to govern independently. The colonial assemblies, which were the legislatures that each of the colonies had, these colonial assemblies asserted their authority to levy taxes, make appropriations, approve appointments, and pass laws. Over time, these assemblies came to see themselves as almost smaller counterparts to the British Parliament back in London. They each saw themselves as virtually sovereign within their colony, just as Parliament itself was sovereign in England. So when it comes to the historical significance of salutary neglect, you could write about how this beneficial form of neglect encouraged self-government in the colonies in North America. Because Britain took this quite hands-off approach, the local governments in the colonies were able to exercise a lot of power themselves, and they came to get used to exercising that power. So another thing that you could write about when it comes to the historical significance of salutary neglect is that when this policy ended after the 7 Years' War, or what's often called the French and Indian War in North America, that war involved Great Britain getting much more involved in North America in this war against the French. And so during that war and then after that war, Great Britain was a lot more involved in the colonies. And because they had taken this pretty laissez-faire or hands-off approach, this really angered a lot of the colonists because they were pretty used to doing things their own way by that point in time. And this reassertion of authority by the British government, it definitely angered a lot of people and was one of the factors that ultimately contributes to the American Revolution. The first essay question that we have that we're going to look at is the question, how did the aims and motivations for establishing the Jamestown colony in Virginia differ from the aims and motivations for establishing the Plymouth colony in New England? So there's basically the short answer to this question, and then there's the longer answer, and you'll have to provide more than just the short answer in order to write 2 to 3 paragraphs if you have this essay question on the exam. The short answer to this question is that the people who founded the Jamestown colony, they were primarily interested in money. The people who founded the Plymouth colony, they were primarily interested in escaping religious persecution in England and establishing their own independent church in North America. So the Jamestown colony, which we talked about a little bit before when we talked about the headright system, they were established by the Virginia Company of London. This was the joint stock company, or what's kind of a precursor to a corporation that founded this colony. And this joint stock company and this colony, they were established to make money for the investors in this company, the Virginia Company. Originally, the aim was to find gold. The Spanish had found a lot of gold in their colonies, and so the investors in the Virginia Company were hopeful that they could find gold in Virginia. They did not find any gold in Virginia, but they found pretty quickly that the soil was great for producing the lucrative crop of tobacco. So growing tobacco and selling that tobacco on the market, primarily back in England and Europe, that became the primary basis for the Jamestown colony. But the goal from the beginning was to make money one way or another. Plymouth, like I mentioned before, was established primarily for religious reasons. It was established by Puritan separatists. And so here it's important to have some background on who the Puritans were. Puritans were Protestants in England who thought that the Church of England was still too much like the Catholic Church. So the Church of England was established because the King of England, a bit earlier than this period, he wanted to divorce his wife and marry another woman. The Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, would not grant that divorce, so he decided to leave the Catholic Church, establish his own church, the Church of England, make himself the head of that church so that he could grant himself that divorce. And there were people in England who were certainly happy that the Church of England had divorced itself from the Roman Catholic Church, but they still thought that the Church of England, even though it was no longer a part of the Catholic Church, theologically and in terms of its rituals and ceremonies, they thought that it still was too much like the Catholic Church. From their point of view, it was basically the Catholic Church with the King of England at the head instead of the Pope at the head. And so you have these Puritans who wanted to purify or reform the Church of England to make it more like other Protestant churches and less like the Catholic Church. The Puritans who established Plymouth, they were separatists, meaning they actually didn't want to reform the Church of England. They saw the Church of England as hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly controlled by the British Crown, and that it was never going to fulfill their spiritual and theological desires. And so they wanted to break off entirely from the Church of England and establish their own church. And they weren't going to be able to do that in England, and that's why they ended up going to New England and establishing their colony in Plymouth. So we have these two very different motivations. The founders of the Jamestown money trying to basically make a quick buck, and the founders of the Plymouth colony looking for a place where they could establish a new independent Protestant church. The next essay question deals with some similar issues, and that's the question of what did John Winthrop mean when he described the colonial venture he and his fellow Puritans were undertaking as an effort to establish a city on a hill. So John Winthrop was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was another colony established by Puritans in New England, a different colony or a separate colony from the one in Plymouth. And it's important to keep in mind how John Winthrop and his colonists were different from the Plymouth colonists that we just talked about. So the Plymouth colonists, like I said before, they were separatists. They wanted to and did leave the Church of England altogether and establish their own church. John Winthrop and the colonists at the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were also Puritans. They also believed the Church of England was too much like the Catholic Church in terms of its theology, its rituals, its ceremonies. But instead of deciding that the Church of England was hopeless and could never be reformed like the Plymouth colonists, they wanted to reform the Church of England. They wanted to make the Church of England more like other Protestant churches and less like the Roman Catholic Church. And so when they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they saw this as establishing a Bible commonwealth that would be a model for the world, and particularly for England, to see and to emulate. And so when John Winthrop is talking about his colonial venture as an effort to establish a city on a hill, basically he wants this Bible commonwealth, this colony that they're establishing, to be so impressive in terms of its spiritual devotion and its social harmony and everything else that's going on in it, that people back in England will take notice and that they will want to make England and the Church of England more like how things were in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They would hopefully look to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this colony that John Winthrop was establishing, as a model for them to follow. Or in other words, it would be a city on a hill. And this is rhetoric that's still used a lot. Many Americans, especially a lot of American politicians, still talk about the United States more broadly as being a kind of city upon a hill, though usually for most politicians today, they mean that the U.S. should be a beacon for democracy or a model for other countries to follow around the world, rather than being a model for a particular type of Christianity. But this same idea of establishing a model for other people to follow, of providing an inspiring model that animated John Winthrop's original quote about Massachusetts being a city on a hill, that's still very prevalent rhetoric in American politics. The last item that we have to talk about is the essay question: what were the primary reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed as a structure of government? So in answering this question about the reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed as a structure of government, it's important, first of all, to know what the Articles of Confederation are. And the Articles of Confederation are the original constitution that the United States had before the constitution that's still being used and still being amended was written and ratified. So when the 13 colonies first declared independence from Great Britain, they had to decide what their relationship to each other was going to be and what kind of government they would have to connect them to each other. Because it's important to keep in mind that these 13 different colonies, in a lot of ways, were very independent and separate from each other. They didn't necessarily have a cohesive identity, and you can really see that with the way the Articles of Confederation worked. So the Articles of Confederation provided for a very, very weak central government. Most of the power, the overwhelming majority of the power that existed politically in the years of the Articles of Confederation, it was in the hands of the states. And this particularly was a problem in terms of the debts that the United States had. So the United States borrowed a lot of money during the War of Independence against Great Britain in order to fight that war. There was this tremendous debt that the United States had, but the problem was the national government established by the Articles of Confederation, it didn't have the authority to directly tax American citizens, which meant that it was probably not going to be able to pay those debts back. The only thing the national government could do is request the money from the states, because only the states had the authority to tax citizens, and there was nothing to compel these states to actually turn the money over to the national government. And so the national government usually only got a fraction of what it requested from the states. So this presented a huge problem in terms of paying back these debts that the United States had. If it defaulted on these debts that it had, it would struggle to borrow money from creditors in the future. And the problems of this weak centralized government under the Articles of Confederation, they were made even more apparent in late 1786 and early 1787, when crowds of debt-ridden farmers led by Daniel Shays closed courts in western Massachusetts to prevent the seizure of their land for failure to pay debts and state taxes. These participants in this rebellion, they were, at least many of them were, trying to overthrow the state government. They also were trying to destroy records of debts that they had. And this attempted armed overthrow of the state government by Daniel Shea and his supporters, it set off a quick counterreaction among wealthy property owners in the area in Massachusetts. And the response to Shea's rebellion demonstrated just how weak the national government under the Articles of Confederation was. With the national government unwilling or unable to commit its own troops, and also not able to provide the funding that the state militia would need to put down this rebellion, it came to wealthy property owners who raised and recruited their own military force and provided loans to support the deployment of state troops in order to put down this rebellion. So together, those forces defeated Shea's rebel army and put down his rebellion. And while it was militarily a failure, Shea's rebellion left a significant mark on the country's politics. If this rebellion had been a purely localized affair, its national significance would have been minor, but it touched off a wave of backcountry resistance to debt recovery and tax collection that spread far beyond Shea's rebellion in New England. And the spread of armed attacks on property and armed resistance to authority conveyed a sense of urgency to those who sought a stronger national government than the Articles of Confederation provided. So in addition to the need for a more efficient federal government that had the power to tax citizens and that had authority over commerce, quite a lot of wealthy and influential actors in the United States increasingly stressed the need for a national government that possessed the military power needed to maintain civil order in the states. They wanted to make sure that the United States would have a national army that could put down revolts like Shea's rebellion and ensure that masses of impoverished people didn't try to get out of debts that they owed or didn't try to challenge the property rights of wealthy Americans during this time. And so these twin challenges of collecting tax revenue to pay the debt that the United States had, and also the danger posed by violent uprisings against authority. Those two challenges proved to be challenges that the Articles of Confederation were not up to facing, and that's what really led to the push for a new constitution. And so we have in the late 1780s, a constitutional convention that's called. It's supposed to reform the Articles of Confederation. Instead, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention decide that the Articles of Confederation are hopeless, so they scrap it all together and write a new constitution, which is the constitution that the United States still has to this day. In the meantime, if you have any questions about any of these items or any other items on the study guide, please feel free to let me know. Please feel free to stop by during my virtual office hours. Otherwise, I wish you the best of luck when you sit down to take the exam.